The ambassador's hands went still the moment she saw the photograph. Not a polite pause. Not a social hesitation. Her hands actually stopped moving, mid-reach for her coffee cup, and she stared at the photo in my palm like it had said something she wasn't expecting to hear. "Where did you find this?" she asked. Her voice was careful, measured in the way that people learn when they've spent decades choosing their words in rooms where the wrong sentence could end careers. "It was my grandfather's," I said. "He passed away 2 months ago." She set her cup down slowly, didn't touch the photograph, just looked at it. "What was his name?" When I told her, something behind her eyes shifted. Not grief exactly, more like recognition mixed with something unresolved. "We need to talk," she said quietly. "Not here." That was the moment I understood that the man my own family had written off as a disappointment, the man my mother called difficult and my aunt called delusional, might have been someone else entirely. My grandfather, Walter Greer, lived alone in a rented house in Roanoke, Virginia, for the last 11 years of his life. Small place. 1 bedroom, a covered porch he never used, a kitchen that smelled like instant coffee and old newspapers. He drove a 2003 Ford F-150 with a cracked dashboard and a bumper sticker that said, "Virginia is for Gorliers," which he'd never bothered to remove from when the previous owner had it. He didn't talk about the past. If you asked about his work before retirement, he'd say government contracting and change the subject. If you pushed, he'd smile in that way he had, patient, a little tired, and say nothing worth repeating, sweetheart. My family accepted that answer because it was easier than caring. My mother had a complicated relationship with him that I never fully understood growing up. He was her father, but she talked about him the way people talk about a distant obligation, something they feel vaguely guilty about not attending to, but don't actually want to address. She called him once a week, maybe. At Christmas, she sent a card. 1 year she forgot and sent it in January, and when I pointed that out, she said, "He probably didn't notice." He noticed. I know because I was the one who visited him. I was 26 when he died. I'd been working at a public defender's office in Richmond, learning the kind of law that doesn't make you rich, but makes you feel like you're doing something that matters. My grandfather was the one who encouraged that. He used to say, "The people nobody shows up for, those are the ones who need you most." I didn't think much about that sentence when he said it. I do now. He collapsed in his kitchen on a Wednesday in October. A neighbor found him. Not family, a 68-year-old retired postal worker named Mr. Aldrich, who lived 2 doors down, and checked on him because my grandfather had once helped him fix a fence, and they developed that quiet kind of friendship that old men build without making a production of it. Mr. Aldrich called 911. Then he called me because my number was on a notepad by my grandfather's phone. My mother got the call from me. She said, "Oh no," and then asked which hospital, and then said she'd try to get there by the weekend. It was Wednesday. I drove down that night. He was in a room with pale yellow walls and a window that faced a parking garage. When I walked in, he looked smaller than I remembered. He had tubes in his arm and a monitor beeping beside him, and he was awake, looking at the ceiling like he was studying something up there. When he saw me, he smiled. "You didn't have to come all this way," he said. "Grandpa, you're in the hospital." "People are in the hospital every day." He shifted slightly, winced. "You look tired. Are you sleeping?" That was him. That was always him. He could be the one hooked up to machines, and he'd spend the first 5 minutes of a visit asking about you. My mother came on Saturday. She stayed for 2 hours, talked about traffic in a home renovation project she was planning, and left. My aunt texted me asking for updates, but never came at all. My uncle, who lived 40 minutes away and had spent years borrowing money from my grandfather that was never repaid, sent flowers. A small arrangement from a grocery store. I know because the card still had the price sticker on the back. My grandfather died on the following Tuesday. I was there. My mother was not. She said she'd had a commitment she couldn't reschedule. I still don't know what it was, and I stopped asking. I held his hand when his breathing changed. I was the only one in the room besides a nurse who came in twice and spoke softly and gave us space. He didn't say anything dramatic at the end. He didn't have some final revelation. He just got quieter, and then he was gone. The funeral was small. I planned it myself because no one else offered. A plot in a veteran's cemetery outside Roanoke. That much I knew he wanted, because he'd once mentioned it while we were watching the news together. Casually, the way you mention a preference without realizing you're leaving instructions. 8 people came. Mr. Aldrich, 2 men I didn't recognize who stood together at the back and didn't introduce themselves. A woman from my grandfather's church who brought a casserole dish wrapped in foil and pressed it into my hands like food was the thing that would help. And my family, my mother, my aunt, and my cousin who kept checking his phone. I stood at the grave and felt something I didn't have a name for at the time. Not just grief, something older and heavier. A recognition that this man had lived an entire life and the people closest to him hadn't been paying attention. After the service, I went back to his house to start going through his things. Most of it was what you'd expect. Old clothes in good condition, folded neatly. A shelf of history books. He liked military history, the kind that wasn't taught in schools, the kind that covered operations nobody admitted happened. A box of tools in the garage, organized better than most people organize their finances. A coffee maker that was older than I was and still worked perfectly. In the back of his bedroom closet, behind 2 hanging dress shirts still in dry cleaning plastic, I found a shoebox. Inside the box were a few things that didn't immediately mean anything to me. A rubber-banded stack of index cards covered in handwriting I didn't recognize. A small notebook with initials on the cover, not his. A folded piece of paper that turned out to be a letter, also not in his handwriting, and tucked under all of it, a photograph. The photograph showed 4 people standing in front of a building I didn't recognize. They were dressed in civilian clothes, not uniforms. My grandfather was one of them, younger, probably mid-30s, unsmiling in the focused way that people look when they're not performing for a camera. The other 3 were a man, a woman in a dark blazer, and someone partially cut off at the edge of the frame. On the back of the photograph, in pencil, a date from 1987 and a city I'd never associated with my grandfather, Bucharest. I took the box home with me. I showed my mother the photograph 2 weeks later at Sunday dinner. She looked at it for a few seconds, said, "I have no idea," and handed it back. She didn't ask what was in the box. She didn't ask about the notebook or the cards or the letter. She turned back to the pasta she was serving and said, "He always kept secrets. It was exhausting." I didn't say anything, but I kept the box. For a month, I kept coming back to it. Not obsessively. I had cases to prepare, clients to meet, briefs to file, but at night sometimes I'd sit at my kitchen table and look at the photograph and think about what I knew. My grandfather had worked for the government. That was the entire summary of his professional life as far as my family was concerned. He'd started his career in the Army, done something afterward that he called consulting, and retired early on a pension that nobody questioned because nobody was paying close enough attention to question it. He lived simply. He never struggled financially, but he never had anything impressive to show for it either. No vacation home, no investment portfolio that anyone knew about, no objects of obvious value. He just had a quiet life that people mistook for a small one. I reached out eventually to a woman I'd worked with briefly, a former federal prosecutor who'd spent years in national security cases before going into private practice. I described the photograph. I mentioned Bucharest. I mentioned the index cards, which on closer inspection appeared to contain names written in different handwriting styles, some with corresponding dates, a few with what looked like geographic coordinates. She was quiet for a long moment. "That photograph," she said carefully, "the building behind them, can you describe it?" I described what I could see, a corner of something institutional, a partial archway, a street sign in a language I couldn't read. Another pause. I'd want to look at the actual photo, she said. But if that's what I think it might be, that's not nothing. What do you mean? There were operations in Romania in the late 80s, she said. Before the revolution, people helping people get out. Not military operations, quieter than that. She stopped. Not something I can say more about without seeing what you have. That night, I didn't sleep well. I started looking into my grandfather's service record through public channels. What I found was almost nothing, which I was starting to understand was itself a kind of answer. Basic Army records from the mid-1960s through early 1970s, then a gap, then a vague reference to a contracting firm that no longer appeared to exist, then retirement. A man who'd been active and employed for 30 years with almost no paper trail is not a man who fell through the cracks. He's a man who was built to disappear. A month after my grandfather died, I attended a fundraiser for a veterans legal aid organization. It was held in a hotel ballroom in D.C., the kind of event where people wear name tags and say meaningful things about service, and then go home to their normal lives. I went because my office had donated and my boss asked me to represent us. I brought the photograph. I'm not sure why. I'd been carrying it with me for weeks, the way you carry something you haven't figured out yet. Midway through the evening, I was introduced to a woman named Ambassador Cecily Marsh, retired. She'd served in Eastern Europe in the late 1980s and early 1990s, back when Eastern Europe meant something very specific and very dangerous. She was in her late 60s, white-haired, with the posture of someone who'd spent a long time representing something larger than herself. We shook hands. We made the usual event conversation. And then, for a reason I still can't fully explain, I took the photograph out of my bag and showed it to her. That was when her hands went still. She asked me to come with her to a quieter part of the room. We found a corner near a window with the city spread below us, and she looked at the photograph for a long time without speaking. Your grandfather, she said finally. Yes. He never mentioned his work to you? He said government contracting and changed the subject. She almost smiled. That sounds right. She handed the photograph back carefully. I need to know how much you want to know, she said. Some of this I can tell you, some of it I cannot, and some of it I cannot. And some of it may change things for your family in ways that aren't comfortable. Tell me, I said. She looked at me steadily. Your grandfather spent approximately 12 years working for a program that facilitated the extraction of individuals from Soviet-controlled countries. People who were at risk, dissidents, intelligence assets, civilians who'd done something that made them targets. She paused. He was very good at it. He spoke multiple languages, he understood how systems worked, and he had a quality that was harder to train than any of those things. What quality? He made people trust him, she said, quickly and completely in that kind of work that's rarer than you'd think. I thought about every conversation I'd had with my grandfather, the way he listened, the way he never seemed to be performing patience. He just actually had it. He saved lives, I said. Yes. She looked out the window. A significant number of them. People who are alive today, who have families and careers and lives in this country and others, who have no idea that a quiet man from Virginia was the reason they got out. Why wasn't he recognized? I asked. She turned back to me, because recognizing him would have meant acknowledging what the program was, which would have been diplomatically complicated at several points in history. She said it plainly, not apologetically. The people who ran those programs understood what they were asking. They asked anyway, and men like your grandfather said yes. I felt something tighten in my chest. My family thought he made up his importance. My mother had used that word, difficult. My aunt had once said at a family dinner I still remembered clearly that her father had wasted his potential. He'd had opportunities, she said, he just never applied himself. He'd spent 12 years getting people out of countries that would have killed them. There's something else, the ambassador said. She reached into her bag and removed a small card, handwritten, and passed it to me. I'd like you to meet with someone, a man who served alongside your grandfather in a different capacity. He's been trying to locate your grandfather's family for the past several years. Why? Because your grandfather did something for him personally, she said, and he never got to say thank you. I didn't tell my mother about the ambassador, not right away. I needed to understand what I was holding before I tried to hand it to anyone else. I met with a man whose name was on the card 2 weeks later. He was older than I expected, in his 70s, slight, with the manner of someone who'd spent a long time being careful and hadn't quite let the habit go. He'd emigrated from Romania in 1989. His family had come with him. His 2 daughters, now in their 40s, had been children when it happened. He told me what my grandfather had done. I'm not going to repeat all of it because some of it doesn't belong to me to share, but the short version is this. There was a situation where the official channels had closed and the window was closing fast, and my grandfather had gone back. Not because he was ordered to, because the man's wife and daughters were still inside, and leaving without them was not something my grandfather was willing to do. He said my grandfather had told him at the time not to remember his name. I didn't listen, the man said. He smiled slightly. I'm not a good follower of instructions. He handed me a letter he'd written, addressed to my grandfather. Never sent because he'd never been able to find him. I read it in the car afterward. I don't remember driving home. That night I called my mother. I didn't lead with anger. I thought about this, about what it would accomplish and what it wouldn't. I told her what I'd learned. I laid it out as plainly as I could. The ambassador, the program, the man and his family, the letter. There was a long silence on the phone. I didn't know, she said finally. I know you didn't, I said, but you didn't ask either. Another silence. He never said anything. He couldn't, I said. That was the deal he made. And he held it his entire life, even when the people closest to him assumed he was nothing. My mother's voice, when she spoke again, was different. Smaller. I called him difficult. Yes. I said he chose to be distant. He didn't choose it, I said. It was the cost of what he chose to do instead. She didn't respond for a while. When she did, her voice had something in it I hadn't heard from her in a long time. I miss so much of him, she said. I decided what he was and I stopped looking. I didn't argue. I didn't soften it either. She needed to sit with the actual weight of it. My aunt called me the next day. My mother had told her. She was quiet through most of the conversation, and then she said something that surprised me. When we were kids, she said, there were nights he'd come home and he wouldn't say anything at dinner. He'd just sit there. We thought he was cold, checked out. She paused. I wonder now what he'd come from, what he'd just seen. I hadn't thought about it from that angle. The version of him she'd grown up with, the father, not the grandfather, sitting silent at a dinner table after a day that couldn't be described or explained. The loneliness of that was something I had to put down for a while before I could pick it back up. A few weeks later, my family gathered, my mother, my aunt, my cousin, and me, at the Veterans Cemetery in Roanoke. Not a funeral. Something quieter than that. We brought flowers and we stood at the grave, and we didn't make it ceremonial, because ceremony would have felt dishonest. My mother read the letter from the man whose family my grandfather had brought out of Romania. She read it out loud in a steady voice that only broke once, near the end where the man had written, I named my second grandson after you. He doesn't know why yet. He will. My aunt placed her hand on the headstone for a moment and didn't say anything. My cousin, who was 23 and spends a lot of energy trying to appear unaffected, stood very still with his jaw tight. I stood a few steps back holding the photograph. The changes that came after weren't cinematic. There was no single conversation that fixed everything, no moment where my family was transformed into something uncomplicated. Grief doesn't work that way, and neither does belated understanding. But things shifted, quietly the way real shifts usually happen. My mother started talking about him differently, not performing sentiment, she's not that kind of person, but asking questions she'd never asked before. What did he like? What did he think was funny? She called Mr. Aldrich once, and they talked for over an hour. She came away from that call looking like she'd found a room in a house she'd been living in for years and never opened the door to. My aunt donated money to a refugee resettlement organization in Virginia. She didn't announce it. I found out because I happened to see the receipt on her kitchen counter when I was visiting. My cousin, the one who kept his phone out at the funeral, started asking me about the legal work I do. He's thinking about law school. I don't know if that's connected. Maybe it isn't. But I notice it. And me, I kept the photograph. I framed it and put it on a shelf in my apartment between two books my grandfather had given me over the years. He's unsmiling in it, standing on a street in Bucharest in 1987, dressed like an ordinary person doing nothing in particular. He looks like exactly what he was trained to look like, forgettable, invisible, a man no one would notice twice. That was the job. I think about that sometimes when I'm working a case, when I'm sitting across from someone who has no resources and no advocate and no one in the room who came just for them. I think about what my grandfather said about the people nobody shows up for. He wasn't speaking abstractly. He knew what it cost to be invisible. He'd chosen it. He'd held the cost his entire life without complaint and without credit and without anyone really understanding what they were looking at when they looked at him. Ambassador Marsh told me in a follow-up message a few months after we met that a small number of individuals from those programs had been quietly acknowledged in an internal capacity. No public record, no ceremony, just a formal recognition within the agencies that had employed them. My grandfather's name was among them. It won't appear in any database you can search. There will be no plaque, no street named after him, no documentary, no moment where the world stops and says the name Walter Greer and understands what it means. But somewhere in a government building, in a record that cannot be accessed by the public, his name exists. Next to the names of the people he worked with, next to a description of what they did that will never fully be declassified. He existed. He was real. He mattered. My family made the mistake of measuring that by what he showed, and he showed almost nothing by design. It took a photograph in a hotel ballroom and a woman whose hands went still for us to finally understand what we'd been looking at all along. I still wear his army ring sometimes. He'd stopped wearing it years before he died. Too much identifying detail, probably, though he never said that. I found it in the shoebox with the photograph and the notebook and the letter. Plain gold band, simple engraving inside. His name and his service, year. My mother asked about it once, saw it on my hand at dinner and paused. "Does it fit?" she said. I told her it fit fine. She looked at it for a moment and then said quietly, like she was saying it to herself as much as to me, "I should have paid more attention." There's no good answer to that. I didn't offer one. But I've thought about it since, about what it means to pay attention, not the performative kind, not the kind that only shows up when there's something obvious to admire, the other kind, the kind that requires you to sit with someone who isn't advertising themselves and stay curious about what they carry. The world is full of people like my grandfather, people who show up without announcing it, who do things that will never be printed or framed or acknowledged, who choose the hardest version of service precisely because it requires them to remain invisible. Most of them will not be discovered. Most of them will die in small houses with too few visitors and get eulogized in a few sentences by people who thought they understood them and didn't. If this story landed somewhat true for you, If you have someone in your life who is quiet in a way you've been mistaking for emptiness, I hope you'll go and sit with them. Ask the questions you've been postponing. Listen without needing the story to be something you already recognize. Because sometimes the biggest life in the room is the one you almost didn't notice. I keep coming back to one moment. Not the ceremony, not the ambassador's hands going still, not even the letter from the man whose daughters grew up in Virginia because my grandfather went back for them. The moment I keep returning to is smaller than all of that. It's my grandfather sitting at a dinner table, not speaking, while my family talked around him and assumed his silence meant he had nothing to say. He had more to say than any of us understood. He just couldn't say it. That's the thing about cause and effect that nobody tells you when you're young. The cost of a choice doesn't always show up where the choice was made. My grandfather chose to do work that required him to disappear. That choice rippled outward in ways he couldn't fully control, into his relationship with my mother, into the distance my aunt mistook for coldness, into years of holidays where he sat at the edge of a room full of people who loved him, in theory, and overlooked him in practice. The cause was service. The effect was isolation. And the people closest to him never connected those two things because they stopped being curious about him somewhere along the way. I think about what it actually takes to live the way he lived, not the operations, not the classified details. I mean the daily discipline of carrying something heavy and never putting it down in front of anyone. That kind of endurance isn't dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. It just shows up every morning and keeps going. My grandfather had that quality in a degree I'm still trying to understand. He didn't complain about what the work cost him. He didn't leave hints hoping someone would ask. He made a decision about what mattered, and he held it for decades without recognition and without credit. And when his body gave out in a kitchen in Roanoke, he died with the same quiet dignity he'd carried his entire life. What I didn't have, what my family didn't have, was the willingness to look harder. We saw a man who lived simply and assumed that meant he lived small. We heard government contracting and stopped asking questions. We measured him by what he displayed, and he displayed almost nothing. And so we concluded there was almost nothing there. That conclusion was wrong, and we paid for it in the only currency that can't be refunded: time. I'm not saying this to indict my mother or my aunt. I think most people do this. I think it's genuinely difficult to stay curious about someone who doesn't perform their depth for you. It requires something, a kind of active, disciplined attention that doesn't come naturally when life is busy and people are complicated, and it's easier to decide you already know someone than to keep discovering them. What I carry now, along with the photograph and the ring and the letter, I'll probably never stop rereading, is a question I try to ask myself regularly. Who in my life am I not looking at hard enough? Who have I quietly filed away under a label that's too simple? Whose silence am I mistaking for absence? My grandfather lived an entire world inside a life that looked ordinary from the outside. He saved people. He kept his word. He showed up when the window was closing and went back when he could have walked away. He was the biggest person in every room he ever sat quietly in the corner of. I just wish I'd known that while he was still in the room,